I don't see him yet, Grace. Do you? No.
Not yet, but I'll be checking the participants.
Maybe I should check. Maybe I should check if he sent me an email, if he's having trouble getting on. Okay, Grace, I think we should get started, right? And
Yep.
Shaina, I don't see Isa here yet. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see you all. We're very excited about this webinar with our speakers coming to us from Israel, from East Jerusalem, and from the West Bank. Isa Amro has not joined us yet. We hope that he'll be able to join. I'm not sure what the issue is for him. But in the meantime, let me just adjust my screen. Okay. I need to readjust this. Let me just do this here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. So we are very excited to have with us Shaina Low from the Norwegian Refugee Council. She is the Palestine Communication Adviser. She is a human rights lawyer, and she gave testimony to the UK House of Commons a while ago. And she also appears on news organizations worldwide. You may have seen her on CBS, Al Jazeera. I just saw you yesterday on La France, TV France. So she appears regularly on the news outlets. And in 2023, she was jointly awarded NRC's Spokesperson of the Year with her colleague, Yousef Hammash, who is in Gaza. And you can see for their media work on the escalation of the hostilities in Gaza. So we are delighted, Shaina, to have you with us. Before I start the interview with Shaina, I just want to show our audience some of the statistics of what's going on now in Israel and in the West Bank. So the administrative detaining, people who have been detained on administrative detention, before October 7th was 1,300. And after October 7th was 3,500, which is an increase of 2,200 people. And overall, more than 9,000 Palestinians are being held in detention facilities. That's inclusive, with and without charges. And the other piece is, since October 7th, as you can see here, over 1,500 Palestinians have been displaced from Area C. And Shaina's going to talk to us about that. At least 14 Palestinian prisoners have died in Israeli jails. And you can see the other numbers there, 372 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed. Oh, sorry, including 94 children. And you can see the breakdown there. I'm going to stop my share in a second. So you can see the numbers. You can see the impact of, October 7th on the West Bank. Of course, we've been focusing most of our webinars on Gaza, but today it's an opportunity to hear about what's happening in the West Bank. You all know that there have been pogroms, that people are calling it pogroms. And, so I'm going to wait for Isa to come because I have videos of some of the violence, of the settler violence, but he's not here yet. Grace, is he still not here? Yeah.
Still not here.
Yeah. Okay, so Shaina, you ready to go?
Sure.
Super. So thank you so much for being here, Shaina.
I'm really happy to be joining you and seeing lots of familiar names and faces on this chat.
Right. So you're from Boston, and hopefully some of your your family and your friends are here. So to get us started, can you tell us what has been the impact of October 7th attacks on the work of the NRC, of the Norwegian Refugee Council in the West Bank?
Sure. So first, the situation has certainly intensified, and the trends that we're seeing have gotten much, much worse since October 7th. But I also want to, before I get into our post-October 7th work, just acknowledge the fact that many of the things that we've seen and that we're going to be talking about over the next hour or so that have been going on in the West Bank also predate October 7th. And that particularly around increases in settler violence, which we saw growing last year before October 7th. Maybe some of you remember that prior to October 7th, there were large-scale settler attacks on Palestinian communities in the West Bank, including Hawara in the northern West Bank and Turmusaya in the central West Bank, which is actually about 90% of that village are American citizens. And in that massive settler attack last spring, there was even an American green card holder who was shot and killed while trying to rescue people from a burning house. NRC has been working in Palestine for about 15 years, and our work in the West Bank has largely focused on Area C of the West Bank, which makes up about 60% of the land in the West Bank, and that is the land that, under the Oslo Accords, remained under complete Israeli control. It's very sparsely populated. This is where Israeli settlements exist, Israeli outposts exist, and this is where some of the most fertile land and productive land in the West Bank exists. This is really the land that really connects all of the major Palestinian population centers, which make up areas A and B, which are under nominal Palestinian Authority control. Of course, all of the West Bank is under occupation. And so our work in Area C has been largely to help Palestinians, who often are some of the most vulnerable communities in the West Bank, remain on their land and prevent their forcible transfer into other parts of the West Bank. Forcible transfer, in layman's terms, it's a violation of international humanitarian law, and it is when people are forced to leave their homes against their will. This can either be with the use of physical force or threats of violence, or the creation of an environment that is so unbearable that people have no choice but to leave. And so even last year, prior to October 7th, there were communities that were leaving. Just about a year ago, the community of Ain Samia, east of Ramallah in the West Bank, had faced continuous settler attacks, stealing of their sheep and livestock by settlers, and just ongoing harassment that led to their displacement. What we've seen since October 7th is that all of these coercive factors, whether it's settler attacks, and almost half of the settler attacks since October 7th have been in the presence or alongside and even with the assistance of Israeli forces, or through house demolitions. And it's nearly impossible for Palestinians living in Area C to be able to get permits to be able to build, which are issued by the Israeli authorities. And so what NRC has been doing in those communities, both through our legal aid program, which is the Information Counseling and Legal Assistance ICLA program that we run, and the West Bank Protection Consortium, which is a strategic partnership between 5 NGOs working together to provide comprehensive support and assistance to vulnerable communities. We work to help and try and keep people in their homes, whether it's challenging home demolitions, whether it's providing through the West Bank Protection Consortium assistance, whether that's building schools, infrastructure, medical clinics, paving roads, things like that, that help to try and build resilience in communities and protect them. What has become a bigger challenge since October 7th are a few different things. First of all, there have been massive access and movement restrictions throughout the West Bank since October 7th. Some of those have eased, some of them have not. There have been dozens of new barriers created throughout the West Bank, or what they call the changing status. The UN refers to as the changing status of existing barriers. So where there might have been a yellow gate that was left open to allow a community to enter and exit, that gate might be closed and have soldiers manning it. We've also seen that settlers, independent of the Israeli military, have gone and constructed barriers preventing Palestinians from either leaving their communities or from others accessing those communities. So that makes it, one, difficult for us and our partners to be able to go and provide the services that people need. And it also makes it difficult for them to be able to access services outside their communities that they might not have. Medical care, educational facilities, things like that. I'll paste in the chat in just a minute a feature that we published just last month about some of these access restrictions and how NRC is challenging them. The other major thing that's making it difficult for us to work is, of course, the increasing settler violence and settler attacks, which make it difficult for us to access communities. Even after an attack is over, it's difficult. Communities might be afraid to have outsiders come in and be seen as receiving humanitarian assistance, because they're afraid that that's going to draw more attention, more violence, more retaliation, not only from settlers, but the Israeli military themselves. And so these are some of the issues that we're facing. Another thing is just because of the number of attacks that are going on, the number of communities that have been displaced since October 7th, it's forcing us to change the way that we're working and the type of assistance that we're providing. So communities that are reliant on herding have been displaced from lands where they were able to graze their sheep. Now they're being forced into nearby villages where they no longer have access to wide expanses of land. Also, settlers have been taking over with their own settler herders and their flocks of sheep, preventing access. So now we've had to adjust some of our strategies. Our partners are being forced for the first time ever to provide animal fodder in order for these people to maintain their traditional way of life and maintain their livelihoods. On top of that, we've also seen the destruction of aid that we've provided after forcible transfer. So one example is a community, Ain Arashash, which is east of Ramallah. That community was displaced in October. Within a week of October 7th, the entire community had disappeared and had moved closer to a village. That village was attacked just 2 weeks ago during a massive settler attack that affected over a dozen villages throughout the West Bank. And the emergency assistance that we had provided to those communities, or our partners through the West Bank Protection Consortium had provided to those communities, was actually burned down and destroyed. And so we're facing issues where it used to be that it was just the Israeli authorities who would issue demolition orders and go, and we would of course challenge those. But they were the ones destroying property. But now we're also seeing that settlers are taking it into their own hands, destroying property, sometimes when people are inside of it, and sometimes they're doing it with the example of a school in the southern West Bank, where they just do it on their own volition without consequence. So I can go more into Q&A, but that in a nutshell are some of the challenges that we've been facing post-October 7th in providing assistance to the communities that we serve.
Wow, thank you for that comprehensive explanation. To what I mean, we have the impression in the United States that the settlers do all of this with impunity and are not punished at all. To what extent does NRC get involved in that piece?
So NRC, through our legal aid program, which works with about a dozen local partners, we are working to hold settlers to account, not necessarily through some of it is actually assisting Palestinians in going and filing police complaints, though those are often not even investigated. It's also very difficult for Palestinians to go and make those complaints because most often the closest police station to where they live is in a settlement itself, and that alone is intimidating and scary. Oftentimes, we also see that settlers beat Palestinians to going to the police station, and they'll file a complaint against the Palestinians preemptively, saying this person attacked me, when it was most likely, in fact, the opposite case. On top of that, we've also documented cases where there's been retaliation against communities who do try and hold settlers accountable by filing police reports. We've seen it in cases where people, like I said, have been detained themselves, or where they've had their permits revoked to either go work in settlements or go work in Israel proper, because their livelihood options are so limited. And so it's quite dangerous. NRC is also exploring civil procedures to hold settlers accountable through tort law and using Israeli domestic law as well. But in terms of accountability on the local level, there's nearly none. These settlers are acting with impunity, and oftentimes actually with the support, implicit or explicit, of Israeli authorities, whether that's the Israeli military accompanying and assisting and participating in settler attacks, whether it's Israeli ministers calling for entire communities to be erased off the map and then having those communities be subsequently attacked. And then also through the arming of civilian, what are called civilian security squads that are intended, according to the Israelis, to patrol and provide security to the settlements, but are often just going in and harassing and intimidating Palestinian communities. We've also, since October 7th, seen a blurring between settler and soldier, where we have settlers going in uniform or in partial uniform, acting as if they're the military authority when they're detaining, harassing, attacking Palestinian communities.
Right, I had seen that. I had seen pictures of the settlers wearing uniforms as if they were soldiers. You mentioned that sometimes the settlers destroy some of the aid that you're providing to the Palestinians. Have they ever attacked or interfered with NRC staff?
Not with NRC staff. One of the things that's been a result of October, but with some of our partners for sure. NRC, because we're providing for the most part in these communities what are considered soft services, we're able to adjust and do more of our work online, over the phone, and can do some of these trainings that we do, providing legal counseling remotely. But for the organizations that we partner with that are providing material assistance, emergency tents, delivering fodder, going and helping to document settler attacks or provide some type of security measures to try and prevent settler attacks, that's where things get more difficult. And so it is getting harder for our partners for sure to access. And one of the things that we've been forced to do over the last 6.5 months is really be a bit more conservative in terms of our security assessments. So anytime one of our members of staff wants to go into the field to go and meet with communities and work with them, we have to get security approval within 24 hours of that movement to ensure that it's safe and that and to try and mitigate the risk to both our staff, because we have, of course, a duty of care to the people who are working with us, and also to the communities, because some of these communities that we visited are very cautious about receiving aid, as I said, because of retaliation. I visited a community in the South Hebron Hills a couple of months ago, El Khair, and they told us about the constant harassment attacks that they were facing. The women in the community were telling us that they were actually sleeping with their hijabs on because they are afraid of having their homes raided so frequently. And we were in one part of the village and drove down to another part of the village. This village is directly adjacent to an Israeli settlement. And as we drove down into the lower part of the village, the Israeli security guard came, took a photo of our vehicle. It, of course, had an NRC logo on it. It made us very uncomfortable. And of course, we worried about what type of retaliation the organization could face for hosting outsiders and seeking assistance from humanitarian organizations. I've dropped in the chat, by the way, the feature that we produced last month talking about some of the restrictions that we faced post October 7th and how we're trying to overcome them, including challenging some of those movement restrictions legally.
Okay. Let me quickly check with Grace. Has Isa arrived, Grace? No. Okay. Shaina, we know about the defunding of UNRWA by United States and many other countries. To what extent does that impact people on the West Bank and East Jerusalem?
I'm not sure that we've seen the impact yet, but of course it's going to impact should that defunding, and thankfully some countries have reinstated that funding, but it certainly will impact Palestinians throughout all of the West Bank, the refugee camps in the West Bank, but also a number of the communities that we serve are actually registered refugee communities or refugees, registered UNRWA refugees who aren't living in camps. And so, for example, we have a partner that goes and provides emergency assistance once a demolition has occurred or displacement has occurred. But in the case where those communities or individuals might be registered refugees, UNRWA actually is the first to step in and provide that assistance. That's part of their mandate. And so we, for certain, should UNRWA's funding remain cut, and should they've had budget shortfalls for years now, but should the funding restrictions continue, we will certainly not just see an impact in Gaza, where of course there's been emergency and crisis mode for the last 7 months, but also throughout the West Bank and also in all the other places that UNRWA operates in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan as well.
Right. Okay, so can you tell us about the forced transfer from Area C and the changes in Israeli policies since October 7th?
Yeah. So as I said, we've seen this massive increase in the number of people and the frequency with which settler attacks are happening. They've doubled from 2 incidents a day to 4 incidents per day in the last year. Last year already, even prior to October 7th, was on par to be a record year in terms of settler violence. Like I mentioned, these are trends that have only intensified since October 7th. And so what we've seen is that over 1,200 Palestinians have been displaced just since October 7th from I think 15 communities. Some of those communities have quite literally been erased off the map. And it's not just, there are a few implications of this. You might say, well, 1,200 people doesn't sound like that much when we have 1.7 million people in Gaza who've been displaced and forcibly transferred. And numerically, no, it's not at the scale that we've seen in Gaza. But these are strategic areas of the West Bank where people are living. The United States and the rest of the international community purport to support a 2-state solution. A 2-state solution simply cannot exist without Area C, where these Palestinians are living, because this is the only means of contiguity for Palestinian communities. And this is the breadbasket and the resource-rich land of the West Bank, where water is, where grazing land is, where there are other natural resources. And so the removal of Palestinians is quickly extinguishing. For most of us, I think that we already were feeling like a 2-state solution was a pipe dream, but I think it's going to quickly extinguish if all Palestinians are removed from Area C. We've also seen that there's an increase in takeover of lands. I think Dror Etkez, who's an Israeli expert on Area C, and in particular on the settler herder communities, which are able, with only a handful of people but many animals, able to take over large swaths of land. Since October 7th, 100 square kilometers of the West Bank has become inaccessible to Palestinians that previously was accessible. That's a huge amount of territory. And so what we're going to see, unless there's a change in policy, unless the international community puts pressure on Israel to stop these settler attacks, to stop settler takeover of land, which of course is contrary to what the Israeli government's stated aims are. We have settler leaders, not just in the Israeli coalition, but but as senior ministers in the Israeli coalition who have as their main objective to take over this land and ensure Israeli presence throughout all of the West Bank. And so unless there's a real policy shift, policy change, we're going to continue to see Palestinians cramped into smaller and smaller spaces, with Israelis taking over greater and greater spaces. Just a couple of other things that I just wanted to add is that, first of all, these communities are not just losing their homes, but they're also losing their way of life as it becomes more and more difficult for them to maintain their traditional sources of livelihood. Most of these communities are reliant on herding. And so when they lose the land that they've used and herded on for generations, they lose a sense of their own identity and their culture. The second thing that I just want to mention is that while most of our focus has been on Area C, we shouldn't discount the fact that Israeli politicians increasingly are discussing more and more about Israeli takeover in other parts of the West Bank, including areas A and B. And I think I would be remiss in not mentioning the fact that we've seen intensifying violence in the West Bank in areas A and B, particularly in refugee camps in the northern West Bank, even prior to October 7th, but intensifying since then. And we've seen Israeli weapons of war, as we've seen in Gaza, airstrikes, drone attacks, killing civilians and targeting civilians in densely populated refugee camps. We've seen destruction of infrastructure, particularly in Jenin refugee camp, Nur Shams refugee camp near Tulkarem in the north of the West Bank, the destruction of roads, water pipelines, even the destruction of cultural objects like statues in Jenin city, where culture is really being destroyed as well. And I think we can't overlook the fact that we have radical right-wing extremists in the Israeli government who are pushing not only for a takeover of Area C and an expansion of settlements there. We've already seen annexation of parts of the West Bank since last year, when much of the military's authority was transferred actually to civilian ministers out of the hands of the military occupation government, but into the hands of Israel's civilian government. But we've also seen that there's an idea to also take over the parts of the densely populated parts of the West Bank, including the areas that I just mentioned in the north of the West Bank and areas A and B. What colleagues of ours have told us is that the type of fighting that is going on and the types of incursions in the north of the West Bank are basically training grounds for soldiers going into Gaza. And so while we often think about the issues of the West Bank and Gaza as being different, it's important that we recognize that the occupied Palestinian territory is one piece of territory, and we're seeing the same policies and practices deployed in both parts of the territory.
Wow, that is such an important point. I don't know how many of us were aware of that they're using, Jenin and Ramallah and the northern area as a testing ground for them. Wow, I didn't know that. I was going to say about Jenin, I think many of us were deeply saddened by the destruction of the Freedom Theater in Jenin. And many of us had met Giuliano Mer-Khamis when he came to Boston. I was just devastated about that being destroyed.
Well, the theater still exists, the
Oh.
theater structure, but I believe that the area outside of it has been heavily damaged.
I see. Thanks for that correction. Shaina, I want to show two slides in this short video, which confirms or confirms what you said, which might be of interest to people. One is this one here. So you had said this, like the settlements will make it unviable to create a Palestinian state. And so finally, UN Rights Chief Volker Turk confirmed that. And then the second thing, did you finish reading that? Yeah. And the second thing is this one here, So this is in the last month or so. And I think the MAPA audience has seen some of these videos of the settlers burning Palestinian villages to the ground. And so I would like to share that video. It's just a very short.
نذوق في العيش سعادا يا بيت منكم عداد أمة الإسلام هبي وتركي عيش الرقاد قدسنا أم المدائن لم تذوق طعم السهاد من يرام تحرير أرض عازما يجفو الوساد أمتي رص
Yep. And that was settler violence, Shaina. So
Yes. So what we've seen is that this settler violence is not happening without Israeli soldiers knowing. Israeli soldiers are often participating in this. There was a video that Yesh Din published just a couple of weeks ago during this massive attack where I think 17 villages and communities were targeted that showed a settler going in, basically dousing a car in some type of flammable. Are you showing this?
I got it. Let me show it.
Excellent.
Let me show it. Because people, you can see the settlers standing outside, the soldiers doing nothing. They're standing outside and doing nothing. Tell me, Grace, if you can hear the sound. Oh, there is no sound on this one. Can you all see the soldiers standing outside there? There you go. They're not putting out the fire. They're not coming in to do anything. Yeah. Go ahead.
And it's important to note that these soldiers have a responsibility, an obligation under international law to be protecting the civilian population, not perpetrating violence and allowing others to perpetrate violence against them. And so this is clearly a violation of international humanitarian law. But of course, these perpetrators go unchecked and are rarely, if ever, held accountable for the types of crimes that they're committing.
Right. Shaina, we know that there have been sanctions issued against individual Israeli soldiers and possibly against one unit, Israeli military unit, though it's unclear whether Biden is actually going to take action on it. Can you talk to us about the impact of the sanctions on your work and the West Bank?
Yeah, so just to be clear, the sanctions that have been implemented have been not against soldiers, but actually against individual settlers.
I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Some of whom may be serving in the army or the reserves. And so there's been a couple of steps that the US government has taken. And interestingly enough, in some ways, the US has actually been leading on this, and European peers have been following in terms of issuing first travel bans to a number of settlers. They have not released the names of those individual settlers who are on those travel bans. My understanding is that it's in the dozens, if not hundreds. But nobody would know unless those settlers would be actually trying to travel to the US and then get denied upon entry. And then there have been financial sanctions against a handful of settlers, and I think one settler organization as well, just in the last couple of weeks. So there are a few things to note. First of all, I think any step that's being taken by governments to hold people accountable is important, but these efforts just simply don't have enough teeth. And so we need to be both saying thank you I'm speaking about this as a US citizen too, saying thank you to our government for acknowledging the problem, but continuing to push them to do more. First of all, most of the violent settlers do not have an interest in traveling to the United States. They have an interest in staying in what they call Judea and Samaria and continuing to be on that land. They're not coming to the US. And so these travel bans really don't impact them. And then in terms of the financial sanctions, again, very limited. These people don't have a lot of money. They aren't, they don't have tons of money in the US. They don't have a lot of money in the banks. And so it's just not enough. I think there are a few things that need to be happen. One is that we need to be ensuring that sanctions are much broader in terms of who they are targeting and what they're targeting. And there are efforts, as I'm sure many of you on this call know, to ensure that US 501c3s that are supporting the expansion of settlements, violent settler organizations, that they are not given tax deductible status, that there's tax deductible status and 501c3 status is actually revoked. Because right now we're all subsidizing, any US taxpayer is subsidizing those people's contributions to perpetrating violence, unrest throughout the West Bank. And so we need to see sanctions that have more impact, more teeth, and that are actually targeting the people who are funding and financing and perpetrating crimes against Palestinians. In terms of this military unit that's been in the news recently, the last I saw on Friday was that it seemed that the US was saying, oh, well, it seems that the military unit has made some changes in the way that they operate, and so we're not going to apply them for now. All forms of US law to hold people accountable for violating human rights need to be pushed for, in particular the Leahy Law, which was how the sanctioning of this unit would have been done. And so it's important to continue to press the government to ensure that there isn't an exception being made for Israel, that Israel is treated the same and Israeli units are treated the same as other countries' militaries that are perpetrating human rights violations, and that there shouldn't be a double standard for the Israeli military and Israeli military units that have the potential to be using American issued weapons and American aid to perpetrate violations of international humanitarian law.
Right. Absolutely. So I think there was a hearing last month I saw about the Leahy Law and the exception. There's an exception carved out for Israel, but for no other country in terms of violation of the law. So we've seen you giving updates on the situation in Gaza, and often, I mean, once in a while, Yousef Hammash, who's located in Gaza, is able to be on camera, but sometimes not. And so you inform us about what's going on there. What's the latest news from Yousef, and how is NRC doing in terms of being able to help the people of Gaza right now?
Yeah, so Yousef is doing okay. He and his family are all okay. In terms of what we're hearing from our staff in Gaza, we have about 40 local staff in Gaza and currently have 4 internationals there. We have a rotating roster of international staff that are going in and out supporting our efforts because, quite frankly, our Gaza staff are overwhelmed in terms of trying to take care of their own needs and it's important for us to have internationals there who can help to organize the distribution and take some of that burden off of our local staff who've gone through nearly 7 months of war. NRC our operations have largely been focused in Rafah over the last 4 or 5 months, 3-4 months. And we continue to be bringing in aid and distributing it as quickly as we can. Usually within 72 hours, we're working to distribute aid because the needs are so desperate. We still have 6 staff in northern Gaza, many of whom have been suffering the same food insecurity that everyone else, in particular in northern Gaza, has been suffering, being forced to eat animal fodder, drink unsanitary water, and struggle to just find their basic needs. I spoke to a staff member on Friday who's in Gaza, and she told me that in Rafah, where she was, the fear is just palpable. Everyone is fearful of this impending Rafah operation, which has been discussed for months now. And there are a few things that are really concerning about the Rafah operation. First of all, well over 1 million people are still packed into Rafah. Rafah is basically a village. It's not a city, it's a village that is now host to over 1 million people and without the proper infrastructure to be able to support people. Many people are sleeping in tents, in makeshift shelters, made out of tarpaulin and whatever materials can be salvaged. And some are sleeping without anything over their heads. There's little water and sanitation available. As the temperature has gotten warmer, it's been many of the public health concerns around the spread of disease is continuing to grow, especially as trash goes uncollected and sewage continues to spill into the streets. We've heard reports in the last few days of children dying because of the heat. It basically has been described that for many of these people, particularly those sleeping in these makeshift shelters, it's basically like sleeping in a greenhouse. So as temperatures rise, people really have no relief. We're concerned about what a Rafah operation would mean in terms of our ability to respond. We at NRC have been planning for a Rafah operation for weeks, if not months now. Months really, and what we would do, we've found and procured facilities in the middle area of Gaza, a warehouse, some guest houses for our staff, and an office space. But one of our big concerns is that if a Rafah operation moves forward, the Kerem Shalom and Rafah crossings, which have been the main means of getting aid into Gaza, will be closed and shut down, or it will just be impossible to get aid from those areas up to the middle area. And so we've been unable to stockpile any supplies for later distribution because, quite simply, the needs are so immense that it's impossible for us to justify holding on to items that we're distributing when people need them today and can't wait till tomorrow. And so these are some of the major concerns that we have. It's impossible to move over 1 million people. There's no safe space in Gaza, as we've been saying for 6.5 months now. We've kind of been recycling the same talking points for months, but that's because the same issues are still relevant months and months later. And so we will do the best that we can to provide services so long as we have materials to distribute and can safely provide services. But we're of course concerned that most of our operations would have to be suspended because it wouldn't be safe for our staff to be out and moving. We're worried that, of course, any operation in Rafah is not going to be simply contained in Rafah. We don't expect that the Hamas battalions that are allegedly there are just going to sit and wait for Israel and fight them there. We imagine many people will be fleeing up to the north to Khan Yunis, to the middle area, and that fighting will continue in those areas as well. In Khan Yunis in particular, I was in a meeting last week with colleagues from NRC and some other organizations, and someone discussed going back to Khan Yunis and not being able to recognize their own neighborhood. That's how severe the destruction has been. And so to imagine, where would those people who are being displaced from Rafah go when there's nothing there for them in Khan Yunis, for example, and on top of that, the number of mines and unexploded ordnances make it very unsafe for a civilian population to return.
Thank you. I do have one more question, but oops. Hold on a second. My internet is unstable. Hopefully it's going to be okay. folks, we're going to open this up to your questions. So Grace, can you open the chat box for people? And so as you begin to think about your question and post in the chat box, and Julie and I will be taking your questions out and posing them to Shaina. I'm sorry to say that it seems like, I don't know if there are connectivity issues in the West Bank, but we're delighted to have more time to talk with Shaina. So Shaina, just on that last point, I'm not sure what that message, Grace, I'm not sure what that message was from Quanta. Shaina, did you see, there was a report on NPR this morning that the finance minister, the Israeli finance minister, said that they might suspend the incursion into Rafah if Hamas released the hostages. Did you hear that?
I have heard that reported. I mean, of course, NRC has been calling for the release of the hostages since October 7th, and also calling for a ceasefire since October 7th. And so that, of course, I think is still something that's on the table. We also just simply don't know. There have been so many times that we felt like, oh, a ceasefire deal might be close, that at least a longer term pause in the fighting would happen. But at this point, I think none of us feel confident in what's being reported until we actually see it being implemented on the ground.
Thank you. Yep. So Gaza campaign, she's an MD. She was recently visiting her daughter in Jordan. Julie, do I need to ask you to unmute here? Can you unmute, Julie? There you go. So Julie, why don't you pose the first question to Shaina?
Okay. I'm not seeing anything in the Google Docs, so I'll go to the chat.
Well, there is one in the Google Doc.
Okay, if you could go ahead and ask it, and I will
Sure.
update.
So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, issued many provisions against Israel that they must comply with. She's asking us, can these videos that I just showed, showing the Israeli soldiers are not protecting civilians and property, be used as evidence that Israel is not complying with international law?
Yeah,
Do you know
so
the answer to that?
yeah, so I think there's a kind of a I think we're conflating two things that are happening at once. So there's two ICJ cases moving forward. One has been the genocide case that was brought by South Africa, and that case focuses solely on what's happening in Gaza. So the West Bank issues aren't being considered in that case. Certainly, in terms of international accountability mechanisms, I think that these are strong evidence in other things, whether it's other UN mechanisms, human rights mechanisms, whether it's the ongoing ICC investigation into Israel that's been open and looks as far back as incidents from 2014. And also the ongoing, there's a standing UN Commission of Inquiry that's looking into what's happening in Israel-Palestine that was established after the May 2021 Gaza escalation that is constantly reviewing and investigating. So I think certainly that is something to be considered. One thing that's important to note in ICC cases, and NRC does not participate in the International Criminal Court proceedings, but just looking at, is that one of the things that allows for jurisdiction of the ICC is when they need to prove that the legal mechanisms, the accountability mechanisms within the country being investigated are not being are not effective. And I think that the failure to prosecute any of the perpetrators that are committing these crimes demonstrate, and the fact that you have Israeli soldiers who have a law enforcement capability in the West Bank are not detaining, prosecuting, and holding accountable perpetrators, that certainly is evidence that Israel has a legal system that is ineffective and unable to prosecute people who commit violations of the law.
Thank you. So someone, Haynes Miller, who's on the call right now, sent me a message that she was on a seminar with Isa earlier today, and he said he thought that the webinar was at 3 p.m. Palestine time. So I guess he's not joining us, and you know, I had pinged him a few times to say it's 1 p.m. our time, so that's unfortunate. Maybe we'll be able to reschedule him for another time. Julie, do you have one?
There's a question about the
Oh,
Freedom Flotilla, and I think maybe and then there's an answer in within the chat box, but it says, do you know what is going on with the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza to bring 5,000 tons of food, medicine, etc.? Is it stuck in Istanbul now?
Yeah, I don't have much information beyond what's been reported publicly. We haven't been engaged in the Freedom Flotilla, which is an activist initiative from with activists from around the world. But no, I don't have any updates on that. But it looks like Abigail said that it looks like it's been postponed for at least 2 months.
yeah, that's too bad. Do you think they did you just say this, Shaina? Do you think they postponed it because of the possible incursion into Gaza?
I honestly don't know. I don't have any insights into that.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions for Shaina? Julie, go ahead.
All right. Continuing about those questions. Let's see. The dock and causeway construction now started for aid. Will that help Gaza? And I think they're talking about the U.S.
Yeah, so just in terms of additional means of getting aid into Gaza, the U.S., Joe Biden announced, as probably most of you know, Joe Biden announced during his State of the Union address that the U.S. would be providing a pop-up port for the delivery of additional humanitarian assistance coming through a maritime corridor from Cyprus. And so, of course, any means of getting in additional aid are essential at this point and needed. But our concern, particularly if the Rafah operation goes forward, is that this pier could be seen as not in addition to the existing means of bringing in aid, but a substitute for the existing means of bringing aid. And so that to us would be very concerning if this was seen as something not a supplement. I think, and even the US, when they announced this pier, has said multiple times that they know that the most effective and efficient way to get aid into Gaza is to open the crossings and have the crossings operate at capacity. We still aren't seeing the crossings operating at capacity. Prior to October 7th, the Kerem Shalom crossing alone was processing 500 trucks per working day. And we haven't seen numbers anywhere close to that. I think right now the average is about 200 trucks per day getting into Gaza. And Kerem Shalom has the capacity to process 1,000 trucks per day. And so it's important to continue to push that all means of getting aid in are essential, but that we know what the aid sector, the humanitarian sector, the international community has all said over and over again that the crossings are the easiest way to get in aid. There are hundreds of trucks waiting in Egypt to enter Gaza that cannot enter. On top of that, there are a few things that are needed in order to make aid accessible to people besides just the scaling up. We need to have a notification system that works to ensure that humanitarians are protected when they're going to deliver aid, and that individuals going and seeking out aid are protected and not targeted while going to gather that aid. And so we've seen over 200 humanitarians be killed since the start of this escalation in October, including, I'm sure most of you know, the 7 World Central Kitchen employees who were targeted in drone strikes on April 1st, earlier this month. And we've seen people seeking aid be fired upon, shot at, and killed while going to seek aid. One last thing that I'm just going to add on is that we've seen the use of airdrops by the US and others, and this is something that really is kind of unbelievable to see the US and Israel's allies participating in this. The only time that NRC, in recent memory at least, has participated in airdrops were in areas that were completely inaccessible, in, I think, either Sudan or South Sudan. I'm forgetting right now which one it was. But basically, these were areas that were controlled by the enemies of the people providing aid, not the allies, as we've seen with Israel. It's unbelievable to see that Israel's closest allies cannot get aid in through Israel, cannot pressure Israel to allow in aid. When NRC participated in airdrops, we had staff on the ground that were there to collect that aid and ensure orderly distributions. But what we've seen in northern Gaza, where these airdrops have occurred, is that it's chaotic. There aren't aid agencies there to collect the aid. Gaza is extremely densely populated. We've seen aid where parachutes have failed to deploy and people have been crushed and killed by aid. We've seen aid blow into the Mediterranean Sea, and people have gotten tangled in the parachutes and drowned while trying to get aid. We've seen aid blown into Israel and not be accessible. And then there are no people on the ground able to help ensure that there are orderly distributions and that aid is reaching people who need it the most. So that's female-led households, the elderly, people with disabilities. They're not able to participate in these scrambles for aid. And the amount of aid that's coming in through these airdrops is a fraction of what's needed and extremely costly to do. And so we still continue to implore the international community to be pushing for the crossings to be open and to allow for scaling up of aid.
It's all so unconscionable. It's infuriating. Someone's asking if the central kitchen, the World Central Kitchen, do you know if they've resumed airdrops?
So I don't think World Central Kitchen was participating in airdrops. I think that they were bringing in, recently bringing in aid through their ports, through the jetty that they constructed. I'm not sure if they've restarted operations. I think I heard some discussion that perhaps they were, but I'm not entirely sure. One of the World Central Kitchen has not participated in kind of the same UN coordination system that most humanitarian agencies are working in. And so we have less contact with them than we have with some of our other peer organizations.
Julie?
Shaina, here's a question is, how are you and your colleagues keeping your spirits up? How are you taking care of yourselves?
Well, I think for our staff in Gaza, there's really no way to keep people's spirits up when we're living in such dismal and depressing times. I'll drop in the chat also a feature that we just published late last week, I think on Friday, about the experience of one of our colleagues, Iman, who lost multiple members of her family, including her parents, who were killed after fleeing the north and moving to the south, and were killed alongside other members of her family. She had a brother who was detained. It's very, very difficult for our staff in Gaza to keep their spirits up. In terms of, I think that my understanding is that having our international staff coming in and supporting the effort has been uplifting, in the sense that they feel like they aren't alone, that they have other people to help carry the burden. But really, there's no, I think the other thing that just thinking about the conversations I have with our staff is like the dark humor that we have in all of this. And so some of you may have heard my colleague Yousef Hammash was featured on an episode of This American Life that was devoted solely to him and his family's experience. His sister gave birth in February to her first child, and the episode kind of documents Yousef moving his family. And there's a lot of humor in that. That's very dark, but I think that that's the way that people are coping. Because really at this point, I don't think any of us really thought like 7 months. I spoke to a colleague on Thursday who is in Gaza, and I said, I feel that 6 months have passed, but when we think about it in terms of years, being more than half a year, it's like, wow, how has this time gone by? I also think that for our staff in Gaza that are just simply in emergency mode, the adrenaline is still running a good amount of the time. They don't have time to stop and think about all that they've lost. They're just constantly having to keep moving. And I think the fact that they're able, through our efforts, to help to, one, have some level of we're able to provide a little bit more for our staff. We have housing for a good portion of our staff and ensure that they are able to do their jobs. I think that has also helped.
Thank you.
I happened to hear that episode with Yousef Hammash. It was superb. And folks, I've put the link in the chat so that you can listen to it. Seems like maybe you've already answered this, Shaina. What's the current magnitude of food insecurity?
Yeah, so food insecurity continues. The UN just warned this week that in 6 weeks they anticipate that northern Gaza could surpass the famine threshold. And so while more food has been getting into the north, it's nowhere near enough. I think in some ways, the issues around starvation have been kind of forgotten, as everyone for weeks has now been talking about what will happen in Rafah, But starvation still exists. I spoke to a colleague from Oxfam this week who told me she was speaking to one of her colleagues in the north who lost dozens of members of her family. And she said that losing over 30 members of my family hasn't been the worst part. The worst part has been the starvation and feeling hungry all the time. And it's not something that can be resolved, through airdropping Skittles like we saw the US doing. These are people who are going to face consequences as a result of malnutrition if they survive for the rest of their lives. We have people who probably can no longer consume solid food, people who are vulnerable and susceptible to communicable diseases and who under normal circumstances would be able to overcome them, but might not because of their weakened immune systems and the fact that their body just simply doesn't have enough strength to fight off these issues. So I think we've been warning for months about what the food insecurity could lead to. And we have concerns still that between food insecurity and public health issues related to destroyed water and sanitation systems, untreated waste, untreated trash, that the number of people who die as a result of not as a direct result of hostilities, but because of all of these secondary factors, could surpass the 34,000 who have already been reported dead.
Right. Someone's asking if that US built pier, do we know if it's already been built?
My understanding is that the pier is supposed to be nearing completion next week, I think. I haven't yet had a chance to read, but I saw that the New York Times today had a feature talking about how exactly the port is expected to run. There's been a lot of questions about who's going to be managing the pier, how the food is going to be, and other aid is going to be brought in. I think WFP has agreed, though it's been there's been varying reporting on whether or not WFP will be there to receive the aid and distribute it. Questions, of course, about the sidelining of UNRWA, which is so essential in terms of their ability to lead in the response in Gaza, because they have such a huge footprint, so much trust with the communities, and just a massive, massive infrastructure and staff.
And so WFP, for people probably know, but it's the World Food Program.
Thanks, Abby.
Yeah. There's a question about there have been many demonstrations and protests on college campuses. Why do academic institutions still generally support this genocide? And is it because they're profiting?
You know, I'm not sure that I'm well situated in my role as NRC
Right.
to answer this question. I wish that I could be a fly on the wall and listening to some of the discussions that are ongoing with administrations on college campuses. But really, I don't think that I have the insight to be able to answer why that is.
Right. Shaina, I was given a message to pass on to you, so I'm putting it here in the chat.
Thank you.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah. And I did see that Abigail had a comment just going back to the food insecurity about the counting of the trucks. And I think that's a really good point, Abigail, and something that we've actually been stressing more recently in some of the meetings that we're having, is that you're right. It's not about just counting the trucks, because it's also about the amount of aid that's going in weight-wise, the number of trucks going in. They aren't all full, and there's also disparities in terms of the number of trucks, because maybe there's one big truck on the Israeli side, it gets divided into 2 trucks on the Palestinian side, or vice versa. But one thing, calculations that we did about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I don't have the figures in front of me right now, but I had a colleague, and his name is Itai Epstein, and he tweeted this out. I'll see if I can dig up the tweets and maybe we can send it in a follow-up. But basically, he looked at, in 2008, Israel calculated the number of calories, the amount of weight of food aid going into Gaza for the survival of the population. And what Itai did was he basically looked at, okay, well, if they needed this many tons of food going in for this number of people, well, then we'd need this number of tons going in for an even greater number of people, because the population in Gaza has, of course, grown. And basically, based on not even the UN calculations, not anybody else, but actually COGAT, the Israeli military's wing that coordinates humanitarian activities in the occupied territory, according to COGAT, the amount of food that's been brought in, according to its weight, is only about 40% of the calories and food that would be needed for the population in Gaza to survive, to meet their basic needs. And it's important to note that those calculations that COGAT made in 2008 that he was working off of were when Gaza still had food production inside. You know, they had strawberry fields, they had agricultural lands that were being tended to. There were chicken farms and sheep and goats and other things being produced inside of Gaza. And now that food production has basically come to zero or close to it. And so the amount of food that even that calculation based off of COGAT's calculations is still an underestimate, given the huge humanitarian needs that have grown since October 7th.
Shaina, there's a question about the trucks that deliver aid. Do they also take waste material out of Gaza?
No. So my understanding is that waste has basically gone uncollected for the last 6-7 months. Gaza is basically a giant dump on top of everything else. It's a junkyard, it's a rubble yard, there is sewage, it is a sewer system. Basically, nothing has been able to be treated or removed. And so there's a tremendous amount of human waste and solid waste, which leads to all sorts of public health concerns and the potential for spread of diseases, rodents, and other hazards.
Julie, I think we're going to stop. I think we've gone through the questions, and before you go, Shaina, I want you to see people appreciating. How do I? Can everybody go to gallery mode? And Shaina in particular, go to gallery mode. And could you please turn on your camera so that you could show your appreciation to Shaina. Everyone turn on your cameras. There you go. And just give her a big, big hand or whatever way that you want to express your appreciation.
Thank you. And it's nice to see so many faces that I know, not just from the Boston area, but also some friends in New York area and other places. So thank you all for joining me, and thank you for your support. Remember that it is important that you continue to push for the US to make good decisions, push the administration to be holding people accountable, push for the suspension of arms sales to Israel and calling for a ceasefire. Those are all so important. And I know that seeing the actions that are taking place throughout the United States is something that is uplifting colleagues, because they've told me that, and seeing the solidarity throughout the United States and the world is something that I think is helping to keep people keep steadfast and continue working for a better future.
Well, we so much appreciate the work that NRC is doing and that you are doing. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending the time with us today, Shaina.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for joining today, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.